Great, thank you so much. I apologize, everyone. Today's been a bit of an IT challenge for me, but I want to thank you so much for being with us this afternoon in a wonderful panel that's going to be hosted by the Miller Center of Public Affairs and the Democracy Initiative. And we're going to consider the question, can we make democracy work? Today's panel is catalyzed by a new book that was co-edited by two of today's panelists, Corey Walker and Thad Williamson and myself, and also a contributor to that book, Barbara Brown Wilson. And we all came together along with other scholars and colleagues at the University of Richmond, Virginia Commonwealth University, the University of Virginia, the Brookings Institution, and other universities around the country and indeed around the world. Thad, Corey, and I began working on this project a few years ago when we started to consider what many Americans are concerned about, very deeply concerned about today, questions about the longevity and the durability and the sustainability of our democracy. People recognize that American democracy is in crisis, and it's not a crisis that can be, quote, fixed simply by elections. It's one of historic nature. It's one that calls into question whether or not democracy in America is in fact sustainable, something that's very deeply concerning to many of our fellow citizens. Because we know that history tells us that democracy isn't guaranteed, and it's up to us, the body politic, to do what we can to ensure its longevity and its vibrancy. The engagement, the agency, and democratic citizens matter in this project. The question is, what is it that we can do? What will we do? And those are the questions that we're going to consider this afternoon. And in fact, we're going to draw you into the conversation as well. So please don't forget to put your questions in the Q&A function, and we'll take those up during this hour. And in addition to that, we're going to ask you a few poll questions as well so that we can get your thoughts and your opinions. I want to now introduce the members of today's panel, their friends and colleagues. I mentioned Barbara Brown Wilson, who's an associate professor of urban and environmental planning in the School of Architecture, and she's the faculty director for the Equity Center, both here at the University of Virginia. Also joining us is Corey D.B. Walker, who's the Wake Forest professor of the humanities at Wake Forest University, and he's the former dean of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology at Virginia Union University. And then finally, Thad Williamson, who's associate professor of leadership studies and philosophy, politics, and economics and law at the University of Richmond. Thad also served as the first director of the Office of Community Wealth Building for the City of Richmond. I'm so glad that the three of them can be with me this afternoon and with all of us for this conversation. So Thad, Barbara, and Corey, the book that we worked on collectively considers the question, can democracy work? And it's indeed called Community Wealth Building and the Reconstruction of American Democracy. And before I turn to you, Corey, I'm going to ask you a question about what animates that question, what led us to propose that question with this group of contributors to the book. I actually want to start out by turning to our audience and asking them a question about their views, their optimism, their pessimism with regard to the future of democracy. So I'll ask the members of the audience to respond to two questions, and then we'll jump into the conversation. Wow, so when we look at the results, things look pretty close. And the question as to whether or not people are optimistic or pessimistic about democracy, 57% say optimistic, 43% pessimistic. And then when we think about the recent events at the Capitol on January the 6th, we have we asked the question whether or not those events had a strong, moderate, or no impact on your response. And it looks like for the vast majority of people, or the majority of people said it had a significant effect. So with that, Corey, I want to turn to you and again ask you about the question that animated our book project, what your thoughts are about that, and who you've come in contact with who fails to believe that American democracy is working, and why.
Thank you so much, Melody. It's an honor to be here today, and it's so great to see you and all of our friends for this important conversation. The question is really animated by a deep democratic deficit that we see not only in the United States, but also globally. That democratic deficit has been measured by such august institutions like the Pew Research institutions, where we see a democratic decline globally. And individuals feel that democracy can't serve the goods that it's supposed to serve. And in many ways, what we're witnessing globally is democracy receding as new forms of authoritarianism take root in countries across Europe, the Americas, and also across Asia. Our question grew not only out of this contemporary trend of a democratic deficit, but it also grew out of a historic trend. In that sense, we're preoccupied with how we've yet to fulfill the promise of American democracy for all of America's citizens. Most importantly, living here in Richmond, we're reminded of the deep democratic deficits that led to, of course, the Civil War, the institution of slavery that continues to leave an indelible mark on American institutions. But most importantly, living half century after the modern Black freedom struggle, we're still not seeing a full and equal society that's enjoyed by all citizens. So our question is contemporary in nature and also historic, and it also seeks to draw our attention to what will it take to really and truly make a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy work in the modern world. What sorts of policies, what sorts of practices are needed, and how can we deepen our democratic practices such that all citizens can live and enjoy the fullness of their humanity and live out the fullness of their aspirations?
Well, Corey, I want to ask you a question that has come in from our audience, because I think that it's directly related to some of the things that you were talking about, and this idea of the practice of democracy and global as well as domestic concerns. And one of our audience members asks, he says, I'm concerned that our elected leaders don't have the intellectual capacity or motivation to deal with these kinds of questions. And the person asks, how can thinkers prevail? And as we know, the project of American democracy, requires people be informed and be engaged. And I think that's part of what may have catalyzed that question. And I'm wondering if you or if any other members of the panel wants to respond to that.
I'll take a quick go at it, then invite Barbara and Thad to join in. Really, democracy is not something that is simple and straightforward. It really is. It should represent the voice of the people, and that voice of the people has many different manifestations. What we are seeking to do is really catalyze those knowledges that may not be represented in the public arena. And that may be individuals from different walks of life, individuals of a deep multiracial background, individuals of different ethnicity, individuals who represent new ideas and different ways of being in the world. That's one thing I think that underscores the community wealth building idea. It seeks to build off of that the commonwealth of all of the human resources of democracy. And unfortunately, we may be in a situation where democracy attenuates the ability of all citizens to engage in the democratic arena at the fullest of their ability.
Well, I'm going to ask Thad a question and give him a chance to deepen our description and discussion of community wealth building, something that Corey was just talking about, and the way that it also interfaces with the question that came from the audience. Now, Thad, in the book, we've proposed this idea of community wealth building as a means and as an end to address the challenges that we're seeing in democracy today and the kinds of challenges that Corey just describes. I'm wondering if you could help set the table by describing community wealth building and what that means. Why is this an important paradigm shift as we consider democracy?
Certainly. Thank you, Melody. And of course, it's good to be with you and with Barbara and Corey again. Community wealth building, first of all, and I will get into this a little bit. This is not an idea that comes from academia. I mean, it's an idea forged in praxis, you know, and it comes out of the experiences I've had in Richmond, but others have had, you know, in other parts of the country as well as, you know, increasingly globally. And it speaks to this question: how do we make democratic change real at the local level where people actually live their lives? So I think there's some basic suppositions behind the idea of community wealth building. One being that for democracy to be real, people have to participate, and this involves more than just voting. And for most people, you're much more likely to have meaningful influence over what's going on in your local community than you are at the larger scale. That's not to say local community is the only thing that matters. That's obviously not true, but you can have more influence at that level. So if we're concerned about participation, that should be one of our focal points. Another key point is that, you know, democracy, to remain legitimate, not only does it have to be procedurally correct, but it actually has to solve problems, and it has to address the problems that are real in people's lives, so that people can see a correspondence between, you know, their input they provide, whether it's through voting or other forms of participation, and what actually happens, you know, on the policy end in ways they can see, touch, and feel. And where that connection is not there, then people's faith in democracy necessarily is going to start to decline. You know, and lastly, and this speaks to something Corey said, in the United States, clearly, historically, we have major limitations on what democracy has even meant. And we have entire, you know, major portions of the population who, you know, have only been partially included and have not been fully consistently included. So for democracy to be real, that has to change as well. So community wealth building, as we've talked about it, and Melody, as you and I wrote in our essay, it's a process that aims at securing the common needs of communities for jobs, for housing, for education, for safety, things that all communities need and strive for, while deliberately building over time a more equitable distribution of resources, wealth, and power. And so, you know, 4 component parts: inclusive participation. That means actually bringing folks into the room on the front end to have a voice, and have a say. Secondly, establishing bold equity goals. The point is not just to talk, but actually to change things. And thirdly, taking a holistic approach that looks at all the resources within a community and thinks about wealth very, very broadly across all different forms of capital. You know, and fourthly, saying what can we do creatively and intentionally to alter, you know, the distribution of resources and then the way resources flow within the community. You know, we're an affluent country, and most of our communities are pretty affluent places. And there are opportunities, if we get creative and we're deliberate about it, to include those who've been left out historically, you know, if we're willing to change some of our practices. So all those goals are linked. I won't, you know, elaborate too much more on that, but in terms of what makes it a new paradigm, you know, I think community wealth building, which is a process that has been going on in Richmond for 10 years on a continual basis, you know, and continues in the present in the form of an office specifically devoted to helping, you know, the most disadvantaged members of our community in Richmond in very, very practical ways, from getting jobs and living wage jobs to most recently getting desks so they can learn virtually, you know, in this pandemic. You know, that's still an ongoing process in Richmond, but I think what we're saying is that, you know, our traditional narratives, especially progressive narratives about change, focus a lot on the New Deal paradigm, or trying to do a New Deal or some variation of that theme in which the federal government is the prime actor and sort of is going to heroically sweep in and change and right all the wrongs. And I don't think that's possible, but also in important ways it's not desirable, because I think one of the things we learned from the tortured history of the civil rights movement is if local communities don't fully buy into change, outsiders coming from the top only win Pyrrhic victories. And so, and you and I have had this conversation many times. We both believe in a robust federal government that does a lot of important things and sets rules and provides resources and establishes guidelines and baselines. But at some point, for community change to be real, the people at the local level have to buy into it. And so I think community wealth building puts on the table that for democratic change to be real, it has to be change that's actually inhabited at the local level, and at some point involves changes in hearts and minds about what a community wants to be about. And I think I'm hopeful, because I've seen it happen, that conversation about hearts and minds can actually transcend our typical partisan ideological divides.
Well, I want to ask you a question that's come from the audience. There's some great questions coming in from the audience, so we want to get to as many of them as possible. One person asked, and this goes to the comment, Thad, that you made, and Corey as well, about this idea of sense of a democratic deficit. A person asked, is populism driven primarily by economics? Does the perception of a democratic deficit arise from a feeling of being left out? Will spreading the wealth cure it?
Well, there's a complicated question, but my short answer is sharing the wealth probably doesn't solve all the problems, but I think it helps a great deal. And so there's a really instructive interview this week with Nan Whaley, who's the mayor of Dayton, Ohio. And the New York Times interviewed her and asked her about her thoughts on why Trump had won Ohio so decisively. And her answer was like, we need government to actually do things and do them fast on the things we care most about. And our community is jobs, right? And if you have a party, whichever party is, that is not delivering the goods to a certain community over a long period of time, of course people are going to lose faith. And of course, a rhetoric that says, a pox on everybody's house, let's try something potentially destructive just because it's something different, of course that mentality is going to arise. So I do think that certain forms of populism have been a predictable response to the failure of the system to deliver the goods in many places.
Yeah, and this isn't just an American story. When we look around the world, we see that similar kinds of challenges and urges that sit inside cities, communities, countries that literally wrap around the globe. Barbara, I want to draw you into this conversation. And because we have you here, and because of the work that you did for this book, we want to think about this issue in terms of universities also being important actors when it comes to democracy and the roles that the universities can play in community. And my guess is that most people who are watching this afternoon have benefited in some way from university, whether it's the University of Virginia, University of Richmond, Wake Forest, and others, whether it's because of education that they may have received, or they're employed by the university because of the often vibrant intellectual and cultural life, scientific advances, kind of the list goes on. But Barbara, you also make the argument that in spite of the work that many universities have done, that university towns continue to be some of the most inequitable communities in the country. And I'm wondering if you can tell us why you make that argument, what supports that argument, and through the lens of community wealth building, share the opportunities that you think universities, including the University of Virginia, have to play when they want to be good democratic actors.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to be with you all today and talking about these things that matter so much to us all. As you know, Melody, this question is dear to my heart, so I'm happy to try to answer it with you all. When I first moved to Charlottesville, I kept getting emails from friends saying, congratulations, you're moving to a place that keeps getting ranked the happiest place in the country. And you know, I was feeling so good for the decisions my family had made and moving to this wonderful, very livable town for faculty. And I am a community engaged scholar. I work on urban planning issues, but I work with historically underserved communities and by my profession. And so I started working with my neighbors and realizing that although it is true that Charlottesville is an absolutely wonderful place for my family to live, when you disaggregate the data and you look along race and income, Raj Chetty's work, for instance, is accessible to many. And he actually ranks Charlottesville as one of the places with the lowest social mobility in the country. And that seems surprising to many people because it's also the best place to live, right? And what's that mean? And so, like a good scholar, I tried to dig into the data and figure out, is this a pattern, right? Not only, and clearly it's pattern in Charlottesville, but also is it a pattern in other places? Because I care about neighborhoods and anchor institutions and how cities work. And it turns out that inequities are very large in a lot of the university towns that we know and love to be wonderful places for our students and faculty to thrive. And when you start to think about why that might be, there are probably many different arguments that could be made, but the one I'll make as an urban planning scholar and I make in the book with my colleague Megan Goff from VCU is actually that university towns are basically company towns in many senses. At least here in Charlottesville, they are the major employer, the major landowner, the major healthcare provider, right? The list goes on. And the things that, the ways in which we enroll students applies pressure on the housing market. There's all these ways that we use the roads, right? Like there's all these ways that the university has a powerful role that it plays in the region. The misfit is when we don't do as Thad just discussed and align our metrics for success. Our bold equity metrics that we need to really build wealth aren't often present in top ranking universities. So universities measure success on research productivity. They measure success on student graduation rates from the university, not from the local community. They measure success in global impact, right? And rarely have universities, at least in recent past, thought about success as the success of every member of the town that supports them. Charlottesville is not unique, unfortunately, as we learn. This is a pattern, but one of the ways in which Charlottesville is very unique is the amazing community advocates that live here. In fact, Miss Joy Johnson, who is the president of the Public Housing Association of Residents and a key partner of mine, just last night received from the National Low Income Housing Coalition the Dolbear Lifetime Service Award. So we really are blessed with some amazing strength in Charlottesville. And so people have been pointing this out for a long time. And so we have been a part at the university of trying to figure out, well, what would that infrastructure look like to get to what Thad describes? What would it be to authentically share power, to actually hold ourselves radically accountable, right? So being really transparent, and then also following up on how well we're doing on those metrics, and really to think about redress, especially in Charlottesville, but in other university towns too. There's the sort of we've got to do a lot of work. The racial wealth gap is only growing in our country. And we've got to do a lot of work to redress these inequities so that we can have a thriving democracy, where everyone is able to thrive and participate. So I think really in the smaller towns, it's about these anchor universities or other anchor institutions acknowledging that responsibility. And in larger ones, it's about anchor networks. So the Democracy Collaborative does a lot of work trying to get all of the anchor networks in bigger cities to think through what their responsibilities are and how they might measure success so that we can value via our commitments what we value in our hearts.
Barbara, a couple of questions and for you, but before we do that, I want to go to the audience with another poll question. And this one, for some, I think might seem quite provocative. Some might say absolutely. So we want to get your impressions on this question. So we're going to put it up here. Given what you've just heard, what do you think about this one? Wow. So a dramatic majority believes that yes, colleges and universities should obligate some of their endowment for community development in the places where they're located, 86%. And Barbara, I'm curious if you can say more about that idea. I mean, given the scholarship, given the work that you've done around the country and your deep understanding of how universities are thinking about these issues, is this something that's really on the table?
It really is actually. I've been lucky to be a part of some work here at UVA that our founding director for the center that has a very long name. Our founding director, Dr. Dana Matthew, is a lawyer, so our name says what we do, which is we're the Center for the Redress of Inequity through Community Engaged Scholarship. And we are not the only center doing this sort of work, but it feels very unique at this moment because of the amazing community leaders that really drive us. So we have a steering committee that makes that governs what we do. Those are my bosses as much as anyone else is. So Miss Joy Johnson is one of those people, but there's a whole range of voices that have the local lived expertise on what redress would look like. I personally do not have that. I moved here, only a handful of years ago, and am a white person with privilege and benefit from all these structures. So my role is really to think through the project of the university and how to make it more useful towards redress. I work with Dr. Ben Allen, the executive director at the Equity Center, and we have a sort of non-hierarchical approach where he is of this community and does an amazing job really leading that local steering committee to make sure that their voices are always guiding everything we do. And then we have a team of faculty leaders from across the university that try to take on the project of research and education and how those look different when, to Corey's points about local knowledge, lived expertise, getting the minds of all of those brilliant, ways of seeing the world at the table, to ensure that the research produced on issues of inequity is centering the knowledge of people that have actually suffered, from the white supremacist systems that have otherwise governed and still govern our research and our educational practices. So one of the examples of how we are trying to be very different in our approach is that the Public Housing Association of Residents had for years been working with a faculty cohort in global development studies on research sovereignty. They had noticed that At any given time, there was up to 28 different separate research projects sort of happening to them. People from the university were knocking on their doors and asking for their input, and that's a violence, right? But no one wants 28 separate research projects at their doorstep, unwanted, unsolicited. And so they wanted to learn from indigenous research models and actually bring in that sort of power sharing that ensures that it's not only institutional review boards, which really are about, the sort of researcher ethics, but without ever consulting those who have the lived expertise to know what would be, generative for them and respectful and mutually beneficial. And so they, through the Equity Center, we said, can we fund you to continue this idea? Because we think it's really, really exciting, and we don't want to get in the way. And so they're completely autonomous. We support them in whatever ways they want to be supported, but we've been able to help them pilot and are now working to set up a real infrastructure with our own internal review board to make sure that no project is ever, happening to public housing residents, but instead with and led by public housing residents. So they decide what gets researched, they decide how the data is processed, and they're resourced for their knowledge and their time.
Well, Barbara, a couple of things, and want to bring Thad and Corey into this conversation as well, given the research that they've done. But a few things from their audience. One, there's a comment and a question that your reference to Company Town brings to mind recent emphasis from investors and management of large corporations about their need to pay attention to all stakeholders, including employees and local communities. The person asked, are there any other parallels there? And then another person said, is the inequity found in university towns an artifact of the type of people/wage earners that they attract to the community, which will lead to a skew in income data? Or do universities specifically avoid addressing the inequity that arises? So I want to toss those two out to you. And then I want to ask another question from the audience about individuals and their roles in this context. But any comparison to the way larger companies and investors are thinking about these issues, given the comment about Company Town?
Absolutely. So the other thing worthy of note that actually we talked about in the chapter as well is the ways in which an institution, not only through its research and its education, but as the question asked, through community development investment, thinks about this question differently. And so another role that I play is I'm on the President's Council for Community Partnerships, which is a majority community leaders. It's community led. And there's a set of faculty and staff from the university and the student that animate and bring us all together as a community. It's been a deep pleasure to be on for the last few years. We ask community, and there was a large survey done that was a representative sample because of the community leadership saying, okay, what should we work on together? What should the partnerships look like that will really make for UVA being a better neighbor, which is a key part of President Ryan's strategic plan. And the top things were wages. So raising the base wage has been a point of advocacy for our community advocates and students for decades. Housing, affordable housing, since we have so much pressure that we apply on the local housing market, recognizing that and actually providing affordable housing for our low-income workers and other community members affected by that pressure. Education, because educational inequities along race and income lines in Charlottesville are stark. It's much worse than the rest of the state, and I, that gets to that other question about like what is the reason for the pattern, and it's complicated, but we need to look it in the face and do what we can to really participate boldly in redress, and then health. So really thinking through public health and how we are a better partner in equitable public health, which has been a longstanding issue that that UVA Health has, been doing a lot of work to try to make better decisions most recently. So in those 4 areas, immediately the president raised our base wage, and the argument there was actually, just as this person's question, implies, that it's good business to raise the base wage to $15 an hour. Amazon's doing it. These other places are raising their base wage to just be better employers, and that it's just a good investment, right? And so that was the first. The second one was a commitment to giving university land to, in partnership with others, build 1,000 or more units of affordable housing. That got stalled a little bit because it was announced last March. So you can imagine that since last March, there's been some stalling, but it's about to. The rumors are we're going to hear good news on that front very soon, and then we've been actively working through the Equity Center because Dr. Ben Allen is a former assistant principal, as are several of our key staff. So working with the schools is an easy fit for us. So it's something we're doing actively, and health is actually something that Elizabeth Beasley in the UVA health system has been working with Cultivate Charlottesville and other amazing leaders in the sort of food justice and other realms, and even our planet or our health district, on acknowledging the social determinants of health that affect any person's life, and trying to really actively work towards co-created models. In fact, I'm honored to say that Dr. Cameron Webb, who's one of our Equity Center faculty leads and a gem of a human being who helped us participate in mutual aid work as a university. So the Food Justice Network was able to help guide community-driven testing and then all the wraparound services that you need to heal safely. And he helped animate that as a doctor in the UVA health system, and now he's in the White House helping to animate the COVID response plan. And to Thad's point, I was actually thinking of Cameron as he spoke, because what he's doing, if you hear President Biden speak about it, he is talking about investments in very community-driven, locally driven decision making that has an ethic of equity behind it.
Great. Well, thank you, Barbara, for giving us also some very concrete examples. And Thad and Corey, I want to draw you back into the conversation. I'm thinking about a question that has come from a member of the audience asking through a conservative lens. This person articulates it. What's the role? We've been talking a lot about community. And community wealth building, but also asking the question about the way that the individuals have responsibility in the context of dealing with issues of inequity, and how you think about that. And I want to add on to that, thinking of others who say, when we're talking about democracy is different than an economic model. So how are you all weaving these two things together? You're talking a lot about inequity, you're talking a lot about economics, you're talking about issues of economic fairness, but what does that have to do with democracy when we think about how it's rooted and its philosophical underpinnings? So Thad or Corey, I was wondering if you want to take on either of those questions.
So on the democracy piece, I'll jump in, but I do think there is a strong internal connection between the civic equality that democracy imagines and social equality. That is, equality of political participation and influence does require a level of resources and a level of capacity to speak in public and be respected and heard, that becomes more difficult when you have dramatic inequalities. So I do think that in a democratic society, the distribution of goods and resources is always going to be one of the fundamental concerns. And when it gets too haywire, then it does undermine the possibility of having that basic civic equality, which is like the most minimal definition of democracy. So I think the things are internally deeply connected. I'm the individual responsibility was an interesting question. I'll just share this. Until pretty recently, Richmond was known as a hotbed of social unrest, and it had a very, very conservative leaning newspaper. And when we started under Mayor Dwight Jones, what was called the Mayor's Anti-Poverty Commission, the paper was still regularly endorsing Republican candidates. It's a conservative leaning paper. And there was a debate internal to that commission about the whole relationship between family structure and poverty, which is a heavily challenging conversation freighted with all kinds of assumptions about race and gender that could potentially be very problematic. So from an analytical point of view, also a practical point of view, I wanted very much the focus of the Anti-Poverty Commission to go to questions of employment opportunity, where we had the chance to build the most consensus. But also, as author of the report, I knew we had to acknowledge that conversation and at least make sure the evidence was presented. And by doing that, by giving even a little bit of a nod to the conservative perspective on poverty, the Richmond Times-Dispatch took us seriously and said, we believe this is a good faith effort to tackle these problems of poverty, and we'll give you as many op-eds as you want to over the next period of time while this work continues. And that was hugely helpful to us and to sort of building, sustaining support and attention to the entire process that led to the creation of the Office of Community Wealth Building. So that was an unlikely ally that we would never have formed, but we weren't willing to engage everybody. If you don't agree, well, I hear you, even though I disagree. I don't assume that you're poorly motivated or that there's not some kind of factual basis for what you're saying. And so I do think that's the kind of conversation that local democracy at its best has to have. And to the extent we don't have it, we continue to reproduce the same sort of partisan boxes that have gotten us where we are.
Thank you. Corey, I'm going to turn to you and start us on the path with a slightly different question. I think it touches on some of the themes that I'm seeing in the Q&A, and I'll turn back to additional audience questions as well. But the premise for this program, for this panel, is that it's part of a celebration of the life of Martin Luther King and his birthday. And I think it's really important to discuss these issues given, as I said at the top, kind of the landscape, the history that we've observed with regard to the sustainability of democracy and its longevity. And in particular, thinking through the lens of all the things that we've seen and experienced in the past year. COVID-19 and its impact on different communities. And in fact, the very, very different way that individuals and communities have responded to COVID-19. The murder of George Floyd in the summer and the protests, the uprisings that followed, the election and the insurrection that took place at the Capitol in January or earlier in January. And thinking about all of those events and the different perspectives that people have on them, I thought about Dr. King's work in 1967, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? And in it, Dr. King shared what he observed after the march from Selma to Montgomery and the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And he said, quote, or wrote, "The paths of Negro-white unity that had been converging crossed at Selma and like a giant X began to diverge. Up to Selma, there had been unity to eliminate barbaric conduct. Beyond it, the unity had to be based on the fulfillment of equality, and in the absence of agreement, the paths began inexorably to move apart." And so I want to turn to all three of you, and Corey, I'll start with you. Today, lots of people are talking about and calling for and asking questions about unity and how do we achieve real unity. And Dr. King points to the fulfillment of equality and the agreement necessary to achieve it. And I'm curious if you think community wealth building can help us achieve the agreement that leads to equality and ultimately to unity. Is this a path that will help us get there? And Corey, I'll start out with you.
Just a small question. Well, what I think in this sense, the attributes of community wealth building offer significant promise. And those attributes are building and deepening the culture of democracy, making democracy deep and pervasive, acknowledging and welcoming the worth, variety, and dignity of all human beings. The third thing, what community wealth building does is it leverages a vision of democracy that is transformative. So it tries to attack those deep entrenched patterns that lead to democratic deficit and that lead to the marginalization of individuals' lives and life chances. And fourthly, and finally, what it does is it opens up a democratic horizon of imaginative possibility so that individuals can begin to use community not as a rhetorical device, but as a way in which we aspire to live together in what King in Where Do We Go From Here would call the world house in which we all live. It's also in that text where King challenges us a bit. In that text, King reminds us that there are no limits of human resources. There are only limits of human will. The question that we're facing right now, and this is a deep and pervasive question, it is a question about human will. How much do we will to actually live into a democratic enterprise that values all human beings and that provides all of the necessary resources to live up to one's full potential? When we think about what Barbara was saying about universities as anchor institutions, we have historical analogs for that. We look at the history of historically Black colleges, and they were the engines of building and valuing community. But unfortunately, what these historically Black colleges, the context in which they evolved was a state-sanctioned racial apartheid in the United States. So what we saw was a fluorescence of civil society in African America and throughout African American communities, but it existed where the broader democratic community was part and parcel committed to a racialized and racist state project that then attenuated the broader benefits of democracy for all individuals. Analogously with that, when we try to build consensus on ideas or consensus on perspectives, what we also have to acknowledge is we're under a minimum of a 40-year assault on the way in which we think about how government can respond to the needs of its citizens. I'm reminded that during the Reagan administration, Ronald Reagan said it, you said it bluntly and beautifully, government is the problem. And when we have that ingrained and when we have the attenuation of the social safety net, then we have individuals' lives and life chances attenuated concomitantly with the transformations in our capitalist economy, where we see structural changes in the labor market. So that we've had a minimum wage of $7.25 for over a decade, and that has never kept up with the cost of living, or what King would argue, not just a living wage, but a minimum living income. So I think King challenges us to not only look at the historic dimension whereby we've had these opportunities and we've seen models that if they were extended across all of society, we can possibly come to some approximation of that democratic promise. But the question is, how do we muster the human will to do so? And King also reminds us that in this world house, that it can't just exist within one community. It can't be Charlottesville, Richmond, or Winston-Salem. when we face a true global catastrophe in terms of climate change, and that this historic pandemic also reminds us of, that our responses have to be global in nature. They have to begin to think about our interconnectedness around this planet, such that we have to respond in that planetary manner, but look at what those possibilities are for acting in our local communities, cognizant that we're always attempting to achieve that dream of a broad and deep democracy for everyone.
Thanks so much, Corey. I'm curious that what you want to say to build on or expand on some of the things that Corey talked about. There are lots of things popping up in the Q&A, people raising questions around issues of power, certainly also on capitalism and its relationship to human will. So Thad, I want to turn to you and give you a chance to respond to that quote from Dr. King, and also the moment in which we find ourselves, the questions that people are asking about democracy and our ability to come together, live together, work together.
Yeah, well, I have to show this off because I am teaching the book this week. But even when I'm not, that book is never far from my thoughts, because it's an incredibly prophetic statement, also incredibly smart statement, in terms of policy, in terms of politics and program on so many different levels. And he pulls no punches, and he talks about a great many things in that book. But what I share with students when we start the conversation in the book is, let's focus on what he says about white America first, because he says there's a profound analytical mistake that usually gets made, is talking about Black America, talking about the conditions of African Americans as a self-contained unit. He says that's absolutely absurd. The real problem lies with white America and the system of domination that they put in place. So let's talk about this first. And to speak to Melody's point, Dr. King wouldn't have been in itself impressed that white people are horrified by George Floyd. They were already horrified by similar atrocities, in the early 60s. The harder question is when you talk beyond atrocities to actual structural change in the distribution of wealth and opportunity. That's where the white folks he observed in the 60s were starting to jump off the train at a rate that was alarming to him. And so that remains, I think, the question, today for the whole country, but especially for white Americans is, are you willing to follow through the logical implications of what it would mean to truly build an inclusive democracy based on racial equity? Are you willing to take all the steps in the argument, no matter where it may go? And it has to lead to challenging questions about capitalism. I think community wealth building, I am hopeful because it gives us something to do and something worth doing even before all those bigger questions are answered, right? We don't have to agree on every larger order question to understand that we need to do something here and now to help people who are suffering under this pandemic or suffering under this economy, and understand that we have the resources to do it if we can find the will. We can get to work practically and maybe work some of those larger theoretical questions out, a little bit down the road. But I think it does give us something to do and to build community, which I think is really hard. And we haven't, Barbara has spoken to some of the human elements of this kind of work. Newsflash, when you have severe racial inequities, when you have severe economic inequities, it's actually hard as a human project to build genuine, authentic, reciprocal, respectful community. And yet it can be done. And I think that's one of the things, as a leadership scholar, I'm interested in how do we foster, develop that more and more people who are capable of building deep relationships of trust and community across lines and difference that will make a democratic project even possible. So I probably have said enough. I'm curious to see what Barbara is going to say.
Barbara?
All right. it's hard to follow this brilliance. I'll just try to add that I think what we don't see enough of and don't seem to be comfortable with is a practice of accountability, a practice of setting goals and then monitoring how well we're reaching them. And then if we're not reaching those goals, then pivoting, right? We don't do that. And I think having a collective will that allows us to set shared goals and reach them is just essential. We've got to be a lot more willing to be bold and say, what do we collectively value? And to Corey's points about thinking globally and about the place we live in and climate injustice and all of the ways in which we are harming ourselves and putting ourselves at risk. If you follow the sort of literature on climate justice, it is not at all surprising that we're in a pandemic right now. And so thinking through how in making those intersectionalities more clear. Racism is making us sick in many senses right now, and if we want to be well, then we're going to have to account for that. And I think really thinking about the sort of ways in which white people have hoarded affluence and trying to account for what a democracy looks like in which we don't allow racism to continue to make us all sick. That would take some shifts.
Well, I thank you all for your comments in response to that question. It's obviously, we could do a whole panel on that question alone. Unfortunately, I'm getting the hook here. So with our last few minutes, and I've been looking at questions in chat, and there have been some great ones. So thank you so much to the audience. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. We're trying to get to as many as possible. As we close, and I know this is an unfair question, but if you could just quickly just give us the sense of something that's top of mind for you, given the things that we've talked about in the course of this panel, in what ways over the next 5 to 10 years might Virginia, or thinking more broadly, if you like, might we need to do to reimagine ourselves? Something we won't have a chance to do a deep discussion, but just give us a sense of what you're hopeful for, what you think, if this is something that we could work on, we could reimagine ourselves in the way that we've been describing in the context of community wealth building. Barbara, why don't we start with you, and then I'll go to Corey and then end with that.
Sure. I feel like Virginia is a place where we could think post-coal. We've got all of the different types of, or not all of them, but many different climates, many different types of economies across the state. And we could think about what climate justice would look like in a state government and how we commit to it boldly. And what that means for jobs, what that means for health, what that means for the ways in which our fisheries can thrive if we have clean water, right? And so I think for me, if we think across the state as a model for how to live and in a sort of loving, generative way, I actually think we'll all, the community wealth might come.
Great, thank you. Corey?
We're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the founding of the nation. And in Virginia, the home of presidents, why don't we begin by moving toward a vision of refounding American democracy, to truly make it equitable, to truly value the variety of our democratic citizenry and open up our democratic vistas. What would that look like? Imagine at the local level, there are more voices, more ways to begin to engage in democracy, more ways to begin to build bonds of solidarity that connects with our state and our national vision of a renewed democracy, and also renewed democracy globally. We can do that. Community wealth building is part of it. And most importantly, it's part of what King challenges us to do and where do we go from here. He challenges us with a transformation of values. Perhaps we can transform that value of democracy and truly transform the value of all human lives across the nation and across the world.
Thank you so much. And Thad, why don't you bring us home?
Okay, well, you know, the Office of Community Wealth Building a few years ago in Richmond set the goal of cutting child poverty in half by 2030. And that goal is still the official policy of the city of Richmond and is being worked towards every day. But it was always intended and continues to be intended that will require not just local action, but systemic policy change at the state and probably federal level. And so the biggest thing that I hope is in the table in the next few years is looking at the ways our boundaries around cities and counties literally construct walls of segregation and education and housing spaces and often the transportation space, such that you have a pattern of poverty concentrated in central cities who have higher property tax rates, who are surrounded by more affluent localities with lower tax rates and typically better funded, just better, more successful school systems that are able to block out affordable housing, public housing equivalent from coming in to their communities, in some cases able to block off public transit. I think the state has to revisit how it has organized local government from an equity perspective. And I think that's part of the rethinking of democracy in America and Virginia that Corey spoke to. We have to start having that conversation sooner rather than later.
Great. Well, I want to thank the three of you for being with us this afternoon, for all the thinking and your thoughtfulness around this question and the big questions and challenges that face democracy, and also for your collaboration on this book. And of course, I want to thank the audience for being with us as well. Thank you so much. And we look forward to being with you again one day soon.